I think that's interesting what Star Trek seems to get wrong. Like that, it prepares us. It prepares us on a story level for, I think, a lot of things that we encounter. But what it shows us as far as technology in the future is often even backwards from the way that things actually develop. They have a huge, like, even in Star Trek, the original series, their understanding of physics is phenomenal. That what were people expecting us to have? They were expecting us to have great understanding of physics so we can make something like a transporter and go to warp speed. But actually, physics is rather hard. But the computers, so we don't have anywhere near that. But yet our computers greatly surpass even the next generation computer technology. The computer that's on board the Enterprise isn't all that great. They didn't like network connectivity is not something that they thought about. I think it's funny that in the original series, like if Uhura asked for Spock for something to analyze, and Spock has to put it on a floppy disk and walk across the bridge and put it into her slot, and like they didn't even think about the computers on board that starship being networked so they could just access the same information.
Yeah, it's funny that they came up with transporters, but not an obvious networking,
not computer networks and things like that.
Well, writers aren't always engineers, so it's tough to get both right. Well,
and they've got, so it's also interesting that in Star Trek they intentionally, or I don't know if it's intentionally, it might be intentional on a more subtle level, but they don't have like really advanced biotechnology. They've got greatly advanced physics, but then when it comes to what is a human, they're just humans. 300 years. You don't have a whole bunch of cybernetic implants. You don't have, mutations or, highly advanced biotechnology or stuff like that. It left humanity intact.
Well, it makes me wonder if, now that we know what AI kind of looks like, why doesn't the Bridge of the Enterprise have an AI captain, as at least as an assistant? AI, what is the best solution for rescuing the Kobayashi Maru and defeating the 3 Klingon warbirds?
Give me some.
Just see what it comes up with. Maybe there's a good idea in there.
So on that, okay, we'll get right to Sable here in a moment. But I was going to say, so in that idea about being often reversed, though, I thought that what it said that V'ger needed humanity to believe in, I was like, I don't know that it needs humanity to believe in that, because those seem like things that would be provable logically, because it says that he's looking, what is there besides the universe?
Yeah.
And it's brought up other dimensions, higher forms of being. Yeah. And then, which Spock says, which cannot be proven logically. But I was thinking, well, like other dimensions, they talk about that in like theoretical physics all the time.
Okay, so theoretical physics. Spock says, or Kirk says, I think he says something like that human capacity to jump beyond, jump beyond reason for creative thinking. So maybe it's the idea that, perfect total logic by its nature is adverse to creative originality. Because if it can't be proven, it's useless to total logic, unless you're saying that there is a part of logic that includes that.
Well, I don't know. It just seemed to me, and I would be interested to know, to actually place that into the context of some of the development of thought on other dimensions and things like that, because it seems like if you're just working through, I'm just going to work through pure mathematics, which seems like something a machine would do, and you realize that, in order to get, the parts of the physical universe to work, it all works mathematically if we have, the string theory, other dimensions and things like that. It seems like a computer would go, okay, well, I guess that's what we're going to have. Whereas when you go to just a normal person and be like, did you know that there are like other dimensions in tiny spirals or something like that makes this work? People are like, no.
Well, what's interesting is I was having a discussion with a mathematician, and I was telling him how, as a writer, when I was younger, I was so heavily focused on the creative part of writing. I go, but as I got older, I started to focus on grammar, structure, form, even formulas. You have to know them, if at least to avoid them. I go, the more I've become a writer, the more mathematical I've had to be. I've had to be more disciplined. I've had to, learn sentence structure and punctuation and all of these little nuances to writing, which seems more like math than creativity, because it's certainly not a creative when you go through to check grammar. And he's like, what's interesting? He goes, I'm a mathematician. He's like, the higher level mathematics you get to, the more creativity you have to have. So he goes, some of the highest level mathematicians, they have to have that creative dimension, or else there's a certain ceiling for them. And I was like, wow, that's pretty fascinating. So when you start with creativity, you have to move towards structure, and the people who are very structured end up moving towards something more spacious and creative. And I just found that fascinating, and it seems to play into this the discussion we're having with pure logic versus that human capacity to leap beyond reason.
That's interesting. That could make it all work. And like I said, it depends on what type of theories were out there at the same time. Because if you gave, my thought was that if you had a mathematical proof for another dimension, you could you can hand that to Spock, or you could hand that to V'ger, and it would be like, oh, okay, well then there's another dimension. If you hand that same mathematical proof to most people, they're gonna be like, I don't know. So I don't know. I was wondering if that was backwards. What is it? But so it kind of, and maybe that's where they were going with higher forms of being, because there was obviously the God component there. So I think I would have written that as more about some kind of spiritual belief than the way it was actually said. Because to me, it struck me as backward, but some type of the spirit, because they were already going the unification of God kind of way. So I don't know, because I mean, the unification with the Creator, we create God in our own image. I mean, that was all there already.
Yeah.
Sable Phoenix, another $10 super chat. Thank you so much.
Sable's on fire.
Yes, in many ways. The Star Trek is overly focused on physical technology. Information technology has already surpassed every science fiction that's been made, other than perhaps in terrifyingly Terminator. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. The difference between physics. GURPS does this. We should look at GURPS when we're the generic universal role playing game.
The game, role playing.
Yeah, because it talks about all the different tech levels and things like that, and what you have to do in order to create like the Star Trek universe, what it can do and what it cannot do, and what we can do now that it cannot do.
Well, I've always noticed, like in sci-fi movies, the future. What are you talking about? Star Trek. I'd say a lot of sci-fi movies get, part of sci-fi genre is that they kind of they slice out a cross section of what they think the future might look like under certain criteria. But it's always interesting that as time goes on and those movies get more dated, it looks more like the era that it came out of than it looks futuristic. Like, I was watching Aliens the other day, and like they have these video conference things they're on. I was like, oh, that looks so 80s. But I was like, but this was supposed to look like way futuristic, in the 80s. And yet now it's only 2023. I look at it, I'm like, that doesn't look futuristic. It looks like it was made in the 80s. So it's like the creative minds can only go so far within that like range that they're in. It's really rare.
We were just talking about that earlier. I mean, with the Star Trek, the motion picture, is that it looks like the 70s in space. I mean, you take like that's what that looks like. It does not. I mean, it looks like the future, but it's very clearly the 70s. But I suppose if you were watching it there in the 70s, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah, well,
this is what it's going to look like in the future. Yeah, this is exactly an extrapolation of what we've got right now.
Well, and what Sable Phoenix is saying, like, information technology has already surpassed science fiction. So yeah, like reality, the way it really develops is always far more dangerous, scary, interesting, useful. Like you said, they didn't even think to network the computers. But then the other question on the other side is, if they showed the computers networking, would a viewer from that era make that be able to connect that as easily as we can?
That's a great point, because it's not like they don't have email as a reference, frame of reference, or Dropbox as a reference, right?
Right.